Thank you very much for being able to present some of our research results. It is about changing institutions and particularly viewing two institutional changes which happen after a formal reform has been adopted. So our argument basically is, once in a treaty revision a new institutional rule has been introduced, it is ambivalent, it's ambiguous, and only in the course of the application of this rule will it be shaped and specified and indeed modified. So what we look at in this research is, first of all, the changing practicing of codecision after the introduction under Maastricht Treaty, and actually the really interesting phenomenon that with the empowerment of the European Parliament, at the same time, rather quickly, a kind of a seclusion happened in which then actually codecision has increasingly taken place in a relatively limited circle of persons in the so-called trilogues under conclusion at first reading, which was then formalized, as you know, by the Amsterdam Treaty. So just to give you a quick overlook about the increase until 2009, what you can see that it started out with 17% of the files and was at 80% in 2009, and 2010 it was even 86% of all codecision files were decided at first reading. Now, we asked, why did this institutional change happen in one article? And secondly, we asked, what were the reactions, responses within the European Parliament to the fact that using early agreements and deciding in trilogues, actually there has been a shift of power. Some have won in power and gained in power, and others have lost in decision-making power. How did the Parliament react to that? And skipping, all the formal introduced, I'm kind of jumping, not skipping this, because you know all the formal treaty changes, and then just give you a very quick explanation how we argue, theoretically. We argue that institutional rules are incomplete because our actors are boundedly rational. They create institutional rules which are incomplete, which subsequently are renegotiated while they are being applied. Now, we argue and ask, why was it that the fast-track legislation or conclusion at first reading has increased so rapidly, as you have seen in the figures I've shown you? And we first look at a functionalist explanation, which just means you save time, you save a negotiation time when you go for early agreements. Early agreements save negotiation times because, as you know, on the first reading, it can be decided by a simple majority in the Parliament, and therefore may be easier and faster to be decided. Therefore, our first hypothesis is then to say, with an increase of negotiating actors with diverse preferences, there will be an increase in early agreements. And here we look at the empirical indicators on the side of the explanandum, early agreements, that is conclusion at first reading and early second readings. And on the side of the independence variable, we compare pre and post the large enlargement round. We look at all the codecision processes of the 5th and 6th Parliament from 1999 to 2009, 797 procedures. In our second hypothesis, we argue that the more complicated, the more files there are of a presidency, the more there will be early agreements in this particular phase. the number, so we measure the ongoing proceeding, and on the side of the dependent variable, we look at the number of early agreements. Then we further argue, which is also a transaction cost saving argument, the more complex the files are, the more there will be early agreements. We measure here the number of recitals in files and the number of committee opinions which have to be collected in order to take this decision. Now, we further come up with an argument which is based on power-based distributive bargaining, that given that an institutional rule is incomplete, the actors who are reshaping the rule try to reshape it to in such a way as to enhance their own institutional power and also to have more influence over policy outcomes. And from this kind of argument, we then distill the hypothesis that it is likely that the presidency, in its 6 months term, has a particular interest to see its proposals, its policy proposals adopted. Therefore, we argue that it is likely that we'll find among the early agreements a lot of the files or the dossier or the policy proposals of presidential report. We have a number of control variables, which I can't go into now, and particularly statistical procedures which we applied. And very quickly, the findings. The first hypothesis, enlargement leads to more early agreements, is confirmed. Workload is confirmed. Complexity is confirmed as regards not numbers of recitals, but number of committees which are occupied with a particular legislative draft, is confirmed. What is not confirmed, so altogether one could say the functionalist transaction cost argument is confirmed, is supported by our findings. What is not confirmed, to our surprise, is that the presidency favorite kind of dossier are adopted as early agreements. It was disconfirmed. Now, the second question which I mentioned, which we are interested in, is look at the impact within the parliament. What happens about the fact that within the parliament certain actors clearly have gained in power, which are the rapporteur, the large political groups, while the small political groups lost in power, the normal committee members lose in power, the plenary loses in power. So, assuming that, and showing that in other work, we then ask, what are the responses in the parliament? How did the parliament, as regards its own rules, how did it react to these institutional changes in the direction of fast-track legislation? Because, as you all know, there has been a lot of debate within the parliament arguing that we are a parliament after all. It should be about debating plenary, about having open views, changing preferences and exchanging arguments. But if that happens in a small circle of a trilogue, that's not exactly what should happen in a democratic context. So what was at issue now with the upcoming reform debate within the parliament were the questions, who is negotiating for the EP, for the committee in a trilogue? What is the mandate of a rapporteur? Is it a substantive mandate or is it just a procedural mandate? Does he have to report back to committee? How often does he have to report back to committee, etc.? And we assume now in this analysis that different actors which are here interacting have different preferences. We assume and show empirically too that the EP leadership prefers restrictive rules. That is, the rapporteur to be controlled strictly. That small political groups prefer restrictive rules as well. Large political groups, by contrast, prefer flexible rules to be able to go into trilogues and to shape policies together with the council. And so do the rapporteur, the big winners of this institutional change, and Constitutional Affairs Committee more in favor of flexible rules as well. So what we argue now in this piece of research, we say, when will kind of a change of rule within the Parliament happen? What is likely that triggers, what would likely trigger a change of rules within the Parliament? And we argue, first of all, it's very likely that if the number of early agreements rise very sharply, there will be a response, there will be a reaction. And our second argument is it may be that an overall reform program of procedural rules within the Parliament kind of gives an impetus to also changing the internal rules regarding early agreements, fast-track legislation. So we look at these two hypotheses, and very briefly we use the same data I mentioned earlier, these 797 cases, and look at whether indeed a sharp increase leads to procedural reaction, and we find that it didn't. We compare systematically periods of a sharp increase over 2 time periods, and there was a very mild reform only, which came out of the sharp increase, which was not binding. It was quite lax in terms of its provisions, and so this hypothesis was disconfirmed. Then we looked at our second hypothesis, existence of an overall parliamentary reform, and we see that in the context of such an overall parliamentary reform, indeed, there has been a partial reform of these internal rules as regards how to handle fast-track legislation, which became part of the internal procedural rules, which makes these rules more binding, and that at least in part there were new rules as to how the rapporteur should behave. But now I've heard in the last weeks that obviously this code of conduct, which has been adopted most recently, is again under revision, is again revised, because obviously it was not effective enough. And indeed, if you look at the numbers of early agreements, since the adoption of the code of conduct, it has gone up. It has continued to go up. It has not gone down as demanded by the code of conduct. So in short, one could conclude that in part the overall reform could overcome some resistance on of the winners of the changed internal rules regarding fast-track legislation if a high level of early agreements is given. Now, I won't have time now to talk about our research on how the Parliament has gained an increasing role in comitology, because my time has run out, but there we analyzed an entire book now, how many delegation and legislation issues there are, and how they have developed over time, in which policy areas, and then in the qualitative analysis we analyzed how the Parliament systematically over the years has actually, through using the leverage of codecision and the budgetary process, has created a role for itself in comitology that is under Article 290 and 91 of the Lisbon Treaty, and is an equal partner to the Council in that respect. Thank you.